Today's sermon is titled, Every Second Counts, Our Experience of Time, Part 2, to be delivered by Reverend Paul Lance. Paul Lance is a retired United Church of Christ minister who lives in Long Beach with his wife Patty and their 4 cats. Paul earned a Master's of Divinity and his Doctor of Ministry degrees from the San Francisco Theology Seminary. He and Patty were both chaplain's assistants in the U.S. Army, stationed in Georgia and in Germany. Paul's first pastorate was at the International Protestant Church in Zurich, Switzerland. In 37 years of ministry, Paul and Patty were in Michigan, Long Beach, and in Torrance, where yours truly was the music director. And I give you Reverend Paul Lance.
First, let me thank Randy Schwalbe and your Unitarian Universalist leadership team in Cambria for inviting me to bring a message this morning. Some of you may recall, back on January 2nd, I was your very first preacher in the new year, and I spoke about our experience of time, past, present, and future, with an emphasis on daring to live in the present, in the now. Well, that experience of putting up a new calendar was natural for a jumping off point for that first Sunday in the new year. The calendar is a tool that helps us record the passing of time day to day by day in discrete blocks of 24-hour periods. Hanging a calendar like this one on the refrigerator is an occasion to reflect back on the year past, as well as to jot a few markers for the wide open span of days and months that lie ahead. Well, today is another unique Sunday morning as we regards how we experience time, inasmuch as this is the only day in the calendar year when we are given 25 hours in the day. This is not a 24-hour, but a 25-hour day. And I hope you have made some great plans for how you're going to spend that extra hour now that we've turned our clocks back to daylight standard time. Pacific Standard Time. Furthermore, it's possible that today is the very last time American clocks are going to be falling back. I don't know if you read this past March, the Florida Senator Marco Rubio placed the Sunshine Protection Act on the consent agenda of the U.S. Senate, where it was approved, undebated and unopposed. It passed. The bill, which would make daylight saving time permanent, has not yet moved forward in the House of Representatives. So again, last night, we moved our clocks back 1 hour. That bill is being held up by representatives of the northern states, where long winter darkness is already a problem, and by rural states where the dairy cows need milking twice a day, regardless of employers who want to shift office hours around on the clock. Supporters say that longer afternoon daylight gives more time for after-school sports. It fights mood disorders such as depression. It increases worker productivity and reduces, they say, the consumption of energy. Actually, golf organizations, where play must end at dusk, view this extra hour of daylight as beneficial to their bottom line. California's legislature, like the Sunshine State of Florida, has already voted to stay permanently on daylight saving time as soon as Congress makes it lawful for us to do so. Florida's Representative Vern Buchanan sponsored the bill in the House, but it is not a current priority in this election year. I mean, you would agree there are more important matters that we'll be voting on Tuesday. The question of making daylight saving time permanent is still open. The matter is undecided. So enjoy your extra hour of clock time today. It may be the last time you get it. Since January, I've given the topic of time more thought. In that sermon, How We Experience Time, Part 1, it was about calendars. Then you might say this one, Part 2, is about clocks. Using a day as a basic measure of the passing of time was a logical outgrowth in connection to a universally experienced natural phenomenon, the recurring and obvious difference between night and day. Everywhere on earth, the sun rose in the morning and set again after a given number of hours, and then the night followed for another span of time. Everywhere on Earth, the changing seasons of the year, the relative latitude of the setting to the far north or to the southern extremes made for longer and shorter spans of light and darkness, but that daily rising and setting of the sun was consistent and relentless. European calendars were designed to record 7 days to the week, with about 4 weeks to the month. Actually, the month is only 28 days long, and that's why we occasionally get a second new moon in a single month, and that's, of course, the so-called blue moon. But I digress. Counting the days and the nights in linear sequence to measure the passing of time was like, obvious. In Jewish tradition, as we heard in the Genesis creation story, darkness predates daylight. So consequently, they count their days as beginning at sundown. Lila v'yom, night and day. Most other cultures either start counting their day at the stroke of midnight on the clock, as we do in America, or at sunrise with dawn bringing the new day into being. Because that's when the rooster crows and the birds begin to twitter. Daybreak is when the red robin comes bobbing along, singing, wake up, you sleepyhead, get up, get out of bed, cheer up, the sky is red, live, love, laugh, and be happy. Day and night are universally experienced natural phenomena. When I was a teenager, I wrote a poem that was published in my college literary magazine, and in it I wrote, I watched God make sunshine today. I sat in bed and I waited for it to come tumbling down. But God made it right in front of me with no beginning. The difference between night and day, between darkness and light, is probably the greatest difference in the universe. But in watching a sun rise, the true border, when one can say, oh, now it's light, it's invisible. At some moment, we just simply realize it's here. That was my dawning awareness that throughout history, human society tends to create arbitrary categories into which lived experiences are divided. Day as something other than night. For example, light as opposed to dark, when there are actually great variations and shades of gradations and all manner of interdependent connections between all those categories. The naming and the classifying that we do is only for our convenience in order to fit various lived experiences into our language. Of course, if I had been raised Unitarian Universalist instead of a Congregationalist, it would probably not have taken me until I was a teenager to discover this, because I would have heard the UU principle of respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, affirmed and promoted from childhood on. So consider me just a late bloomer. But calendar days are not the only way that people divide up their experience of time. The further division of a day into 2 lots of 12 hours, and then dividing those hours yet again into 60 minutes, each one consisting of 60 seconds, was purely arbitrary. There's nothing inherently necessary in nature to warrant such classification. 2 sets of 12 hours each, one designated AM, the other PM. Each hour then further divided into 60 minutes, tick, 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 and each minute consisting of 60 seconds. That's kind of complicated math when you stop to think of it, as we are this morning. Why didn't they design those hours on the decimal system? Huh. I mean, we could have had, say, 10-hour days and 10-hour nights with 100 minutes in an hour, easily divided into decimal points if you wanted to count the seconds, right? The math would have been so much easier if we were dividing by tens. But somebody long, long ago chose 12-hour sets of 60-minute hours with 60 seconds as the basic unit when marking time. And as a result, the passing of time seems to be a matter of calculating the numbers. You're looking at a watch face or at a clock or at your digital readout on your smartphone rather than measuring anything you're actually doing. I mean, how often have you looked up from an activity in which you've been engrossed only to discover how many hours had expired in the meanwhile? You were so in the now, you were so in the moment that you did not experience the passing of time. And aren't those wonderful experiences when you're so involved? The calendars we talked about in January are only one way of measuring and marking the passing of time. More often, I suspect, when we talk about time, it's usually couched in terms of minutes and hours, clock time, as much as calendar days, weeks, months, years. When it comes to history, we might consider passing of centuries or even speak of millennia. But for scientists, the actual basic physical unit of time is the second. And that goes by very quickly, doesn't it? I mean, I've been speaking for about 11 minutes, which amounts to 660 seconds. And did you notice? Look, whoosh! Somewhere along the line, a second was defined as 86,400th of a mean solar day. Now, a mean solar day is not like a bad hair day or a grumpy old bear kind of day. It's a mathematical average solar day. And that basic unit of measuring time, 186,400th of a mean solar day, worked fine for sundials and in the early days of ancient clocks, including, for example, that 700-year-old Strasbourg Cathedral clock, which functions almost like an astronomical computer and solar calculator. For 700 years, it's been calculating lunar time and solar time with an error of less than a second a century while they're tracking the motion of like 5,000 stars. One of its conglomeration of gears is designed to turn only once in a century. You're not going to set that clock ahead an hour when daylight saving time rolls around. But because that way of measuring, the basic unit of time, was based on a calculation of a mean average solar day, and modern instruments discovered that that mean was increasing, this older definition of the chronological second became inadequate for today's more precise scientific requirements. So in 1967, when I was 14 years old, the 13th International Conference on Weights and Measures adopted a new definition of the second, namely 9,192,631,770 times the duration of one period of oscillation at the characteristic vibrational frequency of an atom of cesium-133. I put that number up on the slide, even though I don't expect anyone to remember it, or nor for that matter, do you probably even care. But since one of the 7 principles of the Unitarian Universalists regards a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, I thought this little excursion into science was valuable. The so-called atomic clock measures the radiation that's absorbed when an electron jumps between 2 hyperfine levels of the cesium atom's ground state. You're not going to wear an atomic clock on your wrist. Professor Dr. Werner Gitt, the director of the German Federal Institute of Physics and Technology in Braunschweig, provides this picture of their atomic clock. And he explains how it works in his book, Time and Eternity. And frankly, the physics is beyond me. But for scientists who understand such things, this new designation of the second counts certain sequentially occurring events in the subatomic realm of energy. And what I find remarkable is that the basic unit of time, the second, has been chopped into more than 9 billion parts, each one corresponding to a physical process. The precision of the atomic clock has allowed scientists and engineers to speak of milliseconds, 1,000th of a second, microseconds, which is 1/1,000,000th of a second, and nanoseconds, 1/1000,000th of a second. I saw in a 1997 book of statistics that globally, in a single second, 3 people are born and 1.5 people die. Now, that may have changed a bit in the intervening 25 years since that book was published, but we know that world population is still growing. Every second, 12 million cubic meters of precipitation falls, with about 1/4 of that water falling on dry land where most people live. Every second on our planet, in its orbit around the sun, it travels about 15 miles. Now that means we've traveled 13,500 miles together in the 15 minutes since I began this talk. So bon voyage, my travel companions, 13,500 miles. In a single second, 2.5 million red blood cells are produced in our bone marrow, and 4 billion impulses are exchanged between our cortical hemispheres in our brain. All that is happening right now at this instant in and around every one of us, every second. Wow, we live in a more active and energetic environment than most of us would ever imagine. The point is, every process takes its necessary amount of time to transpire, even if it's infinitesimally quick. As Ecclesiastes 3 puts it, for everything there is a season and a time for every activity under heaven. The scroll Ecclesiastes in Hebrew scripture is accredited to King Solomon, together with Proverbs, as proof of his great wisdom. The opening verses of chapter 3 state the familiar truism, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. The pattern continues for 8 more verses, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to embrace, and so forth, summing up in verse 11, God has made everything beautiful in its time and has also put eternity into our mind. The author concludes in verses 12 and 13, I know there's nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Also, that it is God's gift that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. Cheer up, the sky is red, live, love, laugh, and be happy. That portion of the book of Ecclesiastes is frequently quoted. It even became popularized by a folk song. To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, 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 and a time for every purpose under heaven. I think most of us can live with that linear perspective of time. Recurring routines, sequential patterns, seasons is a good word, I suppose, because everything we do takes time. But then the author of Ecclesiastes reaches a sad conclusion in verse 15. That which is already has been, and that which is to be already has been. And then begins a list and litany of injustices, oppressions, and relentless foolishness that follows for the next 6 chapters of the book. Events are portrayed as vanity and striving after wind. A list of examples of grievous evil and meaninglessness taking place under the sun. In all this, the author projects time as a cycle of recurring activities rather than any sense of linear unfolding. And for all we know, it will go on that way for all eternity, endlessly repetitive. If one takes this view, there is nothing new under the sun. That theme, the cyclical nature of time, is clearly articulated in the opening chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. And I quote, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there's nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages before us. Ecclesiastes 1:10. As I said, in January regarding the past, it can be enlightening to look back over how things used to be and notice how things have changed. That is to say, we can and we must learn lessons from history, but we are designed to live in the present with all the potential energy of current reality at hand, making every second count. So while I agree with the author of Ecclesiastes that there is a time for everything in its season, I experience the bulk of the book as deeply disempowering because the passing of time is assumed to be an eternal cycle that is itself determined to recur regardless of one's present agency. Now, let's be honest about the relative weight of the past and its tendency to reoccur. See, what we've done before, we tend to do again. The last time we spoke, you may recall I pointed out the Bible is full of stories that retell things that went before, our literal past, our history, stories which may influence who we have become. But I said the purpose of retelling such stories from our past is aimed at the present moment and the active role that today has in creating our future. Returning to this morning's text, there is a season for everything and a time for every activity under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, and so on and so on, and so it goes. That long list of life events and activities noted by the writer underscores the point that nothing, absolutely nothing that happens in this world is excluded from the necessary utilization of time and its relentless passage in accordance with the laws of nature. All events and experiences, whether we rate them as good or bad, as long in duration or quite short, must last for a certain amount of time. Of course, on the one hand, we're glad that bad events have limits to their time. They're over. On the other hand, we would like to retain beautiful things forever. Many of us have looked back with longing, if only we could be 25 again, or youth and health are such wonderful things. Why can't they last forever? In temporal reality, in the world of space and time, where 9 billion things are happening in a single second, we need not look back with sadness and nostalgia at what has passed into history. The point of my message back in January was to help us see that what was ending in a past event becomes an opportunity to envision a new beginning, which is to say we're using the past as a resource, not as a burden, because it's what's brought us to this moment. It's a moment of action, of decision, of doing something new. Or if we so choose, we can always do again what has already been. I admitted then, and I repeat now, there is a weightiness to the past because it's familiar. It's helped shape us and our community. But do not forget, it is past. It is over. It is complete. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. I find it helpful to approach things with an attitude of gratitude, giving thanks for what we are going through in this moment, for what we've experienced in this life, and even those things which have caused us pain, toil, trouble. They were also temporal, which is to say, they do not last. And say, thank God. Everything over time is temporary, even the mountains. Now, we could add to that familiar list in Ecclesiastes that there's also a time for childhood and a time for youth, a time for adulthood and a time for death. There's a time to be single and to sow our wild oats, a time to be married and to be productive. There is a time to have friends and a time to be lonely, a time to be healthy and a time to be sick, a time to be well rested and a time for deep fatigue. There's a time to be patient and a time to have had it up to here. There's a time to be happy and a time to be depressed, a time to pray and a time to wait to see how things will develop. Over time, We experience recurring events such as being hungry and then being satisfied, periodically recurring joys and occasions of sorrow, but there are many things that occur only once. If it was up to our physical memories to carry all those meaningful moments ahead, we would fail and everything would be transitory, everything would be ephemeral. But the writer of Ecclesiastes hints that in God things endure forever. I know that whatever God does endures forever. And God has also put eternity into our mind. And so I conclude this second reflection about how we experience time with a hopeful assurance that the ever-present energy that I call God, that higher power, that merciful one, that Holy Spirit, that enduring entity of creativity, however you choose to name it, who is involved at every level of activity in every nanosecond of being, has a better memory than mine. If God is real and present in this moment, I believe those things of value and beauty and meaningful progress in which we are involved now and throughout our lives will be part of God's experience of us and of the world. Let me say that again because I think it's fundamental. If God is real and present in this moment, I believe those things of value and beauty and meaningful progress in which we are involved now will be part of God's experience of us and of the world. If the novelty that we bring to this moment, the energy that we invest in this second, this hour, this day, adds to the qualitative good of our evolving universe, surely God will retain that good and maximize its influence in moments yet to come. Let me say that again, if I may be so bold. If this present moment adds to the qualitative good, the beauty, novelty, and complexity of our evolving universe, surely a good God will retain that good and maximize its influence in moments yet to come, whether we are alive to experience it or we've passed on. Our Creator is still creating. In my opinion, there is the eternity of lasting value of which my life is a component. In God's ever-present involvement with life as it is, and as it is evolving toward a better future for all. In the end, I agree with the words from Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 18. Behold, what I have seen to be good and to be fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of one's life which God has given us. For this is our lot. For he or she will not much remember the days of his life or her life, because God keeps them occupied with joy in their heart. In other words, go ahead, live with gusto the days that God gives us. Make every second count, for while they may not be long remembered by you and me, that which is joyful, that which is meaningful, creative, beautiful, novel, will be retained in the fullness of God's time, which is eternal. And so I said back in January, I challenge you to dare to live now, with the uncertainty of what's coming next as part of the spice of life. Ecclesiastes was wrong. There are new things under the sun. Things don't have to be repetitive unless we choose to repeat them. The future is not determined. As I've said twice already, the events of our past have brought us to this moment, a moment of action, of decision, of doing something new. I believe that the future is open, ours to choose within limits, of course. The indeterminate nature of life, the open uncertainty of tomorrow, is more than the mere spice of life. It's the basic meat and potatoes of life. I encourage you again today, as I did in January, to live with eyes wide open to what's at hand every second, to eat and to drink and to find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, finding joy in the incomplete and essentially malleable reality of daily life as it comes to us in every 24 hours on the calendar. Spend your time with extravagance. Use it up to its fullest. Make every second count. Enjoy. Amen.